Hi, everyone, and welcome back to America House. I'm Jessica, as you may know already, an American space volunteer at Chisinau. And today, we're going to be talking about writing with Mr. Ford, our guest speaker, and the director of Heritage International School. Mr. Ford, how are you?
Hi, Jess. Nice to see you, and thank you for the invite to come and do this as well. It's a beautiful day out there in Moldova right now, so hopefully people are watching this and on their phones. But it's great to talk about writing and to be here. So thank you for the invite.
Of course, anytime. And why don't you start off by explaining why are you in Moldova? What brings you here?
It's a good question. Why Moldova? I think this is my fourth year now working at Heritage as director, but I've had a long relationship with Moldova now for nearly 10 years, working with different schools and educators. And I kind of wear lots of hats in the sort of work that I do. So one of the hats I wear is to advise on international education and sort of global learning. And that's kind of what brought me to Moldova, because I've had a really interesting career where I've worked in countries around the world, in Indonesia, time in Siberia, in Tomsk, Canada, all over Europe, with India. And I love this element because it connects the globe. It's something I'm very passionate about, which is development of global citizenship and our international mindedness and the things that unite and connect us, and also the things we celebrate, like our diversity and our different cultures and our different ways of living and bringing all that together. Education is so important to me. I came from a very working class family. My father was a coal miner, so he literally gave his sunlight up for his children for nearly 40 years. So I was the first in my family to go to university. I went to the University of York to read history and politics. And I had great teachers. I knew the value of people who presented new ideas, new ways of thinking, to challenge you, to give you aspirations. And I suppose it was inevitable that I would fall into education. And part of my heritage is coming from Wales. So Wales is really important to me, a real land of poets and song and writing and great stories and myths. So I ended up by the sea at Aberystwyth, University of Aberystwyth. And in terms of education and teaching, I absolutely, it's my passion. It's been nearly 30 years now since I started to be a teacher. And I ended up as a principal. And I think you know the story, Jess, but for those listening. So by a strange coincidence, not through any choice, I ended up as the principal of a school called Wydene, which is on the Welsh-English borders near Bristol, where I'm from. And this was the school of J.K. Rowling. And she had all her school career there. She based a lot of the characters in the books on for the Harry Potter books on her experiences at school. And I had the strange privilege of being able to say that I had Dumbledore's office for my study when I was the principal of this school, because this was the first head teacher, a guy called Ken Smith, had been her head teacher, and she'd based the Dumbledore character. So I used to love throwing that one at people, that I was in Dumbledore's office. I didn't find the magic, I have to say, not in the literal sense, but we certainly had a magical school, and I really enjoyed the time there. And I had the opportunity to start working with Heritage at the start of the project. It'd been going for a year or two. The two owners, Mrs. Natalia Tetitova and Mr. Sinan Bora, have got an amazing vision for education, which goes beyond Heritage in Moldova. Again, a part of outward-facing mentality and bringing in all that different culture, because Moldova really is at the crucible of Europe. It's had so many influences on it, and it's got a really incredible sort of history and story. And it was just too good an opportunity not to come and bring all of that and work here. And we all know the last few years have been fairly tumultuous with COVID and what's been going on across the border. But at the same time, I love the hope here. I love all the energy. I love the work we're all doing towards the future. And I guess it was almost, whenever you look back at one's life, you always think there's a natural inevitability about everything. This step led to this step, and this consequence led to this consequence. It doesn't. It's pretty random. And sometimes the decisions you make and take they take you in a direction you never even imagined. So I love the combination. Moldova, the small nation on the eastern side of Europe with very proud people, and coming from Wales on the western side of Europe, another very proud people as well. So I think there is an inevitability in my life for that amount of time. So there we go. That's what brought me to Moldova, Jess. I can feel some gaps in as well. I'm drinking tea here because, as you know, we've been helping the dog shelter today for Ariel Foms with donations, and I'm going to drink some tea, my first cup for the day. Okay, so.
Yeah, I wish I was there. I love visiting the dog shelter, Avon, Ariel, and also I love your story. I wish I could visit England and Wales one day. It's one of my dreams on my bucket list. And let's move on to what made you interested in writing? Because you are an amazing writer. I've seen your works everywhere. Yeah. So what made you interested?
It's a good question. Thank you for saying that. Because I see myself first and foremost as an educator. I see myself as a teacher, even though I'm sort of an administrator in the sense of being a director, being a principal, being a school leader. I've always loved stories. I think every culture has a strong tradition, even if it doesn't seem that way, of explaining the world, of stories, of escapism. Wales and England have a really strong literary culture. We all know that. We can go from Shakespeare to Dylan Thomas, and that had a profound influence on me. I've always loved the way that people can craft stories to fire up the imagination or to explain things. Moldova, Romanian, Russian culture, that's also very much part of that strong literary tradition as well, which I really like as well, from Eminescu to Pushkin to modern writers. I suppose my first passion has always been history. So for me, it's the story of history I got really involved in. So I came from a very historical area. So it's the eastern part of a county called Shropshire, which is on the Welsh-English borders. And within about 15 or 20-minute drive where my parents live and where I'm from, you can encompass about 3,000 years of history. So you go from the Celtic Iron Age hill fort to a place called on a mountain called the Wrekin. You come past the old Roman city called Wroxeter, which was called Vericonium, along the Watling Street, the old Roman road, medieval Buildwas Abbey, and you end up in something called the Severn Gorge, which at Coalbrookdale basically gave the world capitalism. It was where the Industrial Revolution happened in 1709, when a guy called Abram Darby I smelted coke and iron and had a new process for steel, and the world changed. It changed in a small valley. And I loved all the stories. I loved being able to take a walk as a kid along the ancient River Severn, and even in my sort of village, the King Charles II. I mean, I got King Charles III, of course. Now the Queen died this summer, but King Charles II hid in this barn in my village, and this plaque is there. So I think of that story because he was meant to have hidden up an oak tree to escape Parliament soldiers during the English Civil War in the 1640s, 1650s. So I've always liked this idea, and I came from a household where people like to talk, people like to have conversations, people like to fill the day in, and often, sometimes it was gossip, sometimes it was, but these are all the kind of stories of life. And one of my favorite historians died this year, David McCullough, who's an American historian. He was 85, but wrote some tremendous books on unknown presidents that perhaps should have had more in their history roles than had been warranted by historians. And people like John Adams, the second US president, or Harry Truman, who came after Franklin D. Roosevelt, and was basically the architect of the Cold War infrastructure for the West. But David McCullough talked about narrative history, and he talked about, you can take a fact like the king died and then the queen died subsequently as a fact, or you can take the fact that the king was murdered and the queen died of a broken heart, and suddenly you've got a story. And it's this type of narrative of history that fascinated me. And interestingly, because I never thought of a career, or I didn't even study English literature at school for A-level, but I did for IGCSE equivalent to my GCSEs. And I had some really good English teachers and literature teachers who pushed books. And I was very fortunate to go to a school where teachers weren't sort of commanded to go religiously through the curriculum every day on a set. They actually allowed you to innovate, and actually lessons could stop and explore questions or explore something that happened in the news. And nobody felt about screaming that somehow the kids weren't getting their education. And I had some really good teachers like this. And one of the ones, he's still alive now, he's 90, is effectively my mentor, a guy called Les Jones. And we had a very similar background, but he went up to Oxford from his coal mining background as a working class boy. And Les was one of those remarkable teachers that pushed books at you and really challenged you. So I was struggling to find a reconciliation between coming from a working class background, the way I spoke, because as you know, in England, the class system is still very rigid, and how someone speaks and dresses and acts and their culture is very, very significant, even in 2022. And back then in the 1980s, my father was a coal miner on strike, and it was very difficult to kind of reconcile these worlds. And he was able to find me literature that I really, so I mean, my first early writers that I liked reading, people like George Orwell, and not the 1984 sort of Animal Farm type of stuff, but stuff that Orwell had written before that, Homage to Catalonia, Down and Out in London and Paris. Some of the English authors like D.H. Lawrence, which was still controversial because of things like Lady Chatterley's Lover, a book that was banned because of its sexual content and the language that it used. But actually, these were stories about kind of working class people. And so this really spoke to me. And some of the poetry I really enjoyed as well. And I suppose I liked myself, we would often go camping, and as kind of as a gang of sort of boys, we in the summers, we were quite lucky to have almost an idealistic childhood. And part of this was telling stories. And we were very lucky. There was a range of hills in South Shropshire called the Stiper Stones. And if ever you look them up, Halloween is very special because it's meant to be the devil's chair is on top of the Stiper Stones, these very strange kind of rocks that are on the top of the hill there. And so there's lots of stories from that in history anyway. And there's a very famous writer called Mary Webb, who's very influenced by the area in South Shropshire. And it is quite a strange sort of dark kind of place on the borders. Borderlands always are. We know that as we're in a kind of borderland area. There's always like lots of different genres running through things. So when we would go camping, I mean, there's a great story about, I know your brother's called Eric, so forgive me, Jess, but Headless Eric. And he was this Saxon hero. Don't tell him this. And he was this Saxon hero who fought the Normans. And when England was in peril, he was hiding in his cave, ready to. So we would go there as gangs of boys and sort of have these incredible adventures. And part of that was making a fire and sitting around. It was all supervised, I have to say. There was an adult down the road. But it was wonderful. And I suppose it came from that traditions. And I didn't see myself ever being a writer because I was of a generation that actually wasn't taught good grammar in school. By that point, pedagogy had sort of moved away from these very strict ideas of teaching the rules of writing or the rules of sentence construction, which probably was good on one level, but on the same level, when you look at really powerful writers, I mean, Abraham Lincoln was sort of self-taught, but it was the Bible and Shakespeare that were the two biggest influences on the way that he spoke and put speeches together. And he was a great storyteller. Part of his appeal was his ability to write stories and to communicate in that way. And so often we don't have to have that formal education. I think people sometimes feel like some of the greatest writers haven't. And I think it was fortunate for me I didn't get into a particular sort of traditional genre of literature, and everybody would read Shakespeare. And when I went to university, and I felt very out of place at university at York, it took me a long time to settle and to get into university life and to feel I belonged there. But I ended up working in a theatre, and in the theatre, I then got introduced every night to see such an eclectic range of writers and performances. And I think that really influenced me as well. But it was never the conscious decision to start writing. And I did start to put little things together, short stories, but only privately and not to sort of, it was only, I suppose, in terms of starting to be really serious about this. When I became a school leader, and this sounds really strange, the jump from education into writing, But you are a communicator. You have to be able to communicate effectively and tell the story. So there was a great leadership guru who basically said a school leader is both a historian and a futurologist, because you are putting together the story of the school, but also you're taking the school into another sort of dimension. You're taking it into a vision, into a pathway. And I've often thought about that, because often you do that, and you have to bring things together, and you have to kind of put a narrative on it. So I suppose in many respects, when you communicate, that's what you're doing. And I'll just finish on this one, where it started kind of formally. So when I was appointed at Wydene, the school had been through a very difficult time. It had a strike. It sort of had a bad inspection report. A lot of toxic culture was in the school. I had to find a way to bring a good story to the school and to find the heart of everything and the soul, which is often what leadership is sometimes about. So knowing my history and being a student of history, so I started with a very simple blog. So not J.K. Rowling, I've got to say this, although she is from this part of the world. It's called The Forest of Dean. And for America House, it's a lot like I spent time in Appalachia in West Virginia and Virginia. So it's that kind of rural, poor area, but there's loads of traditions, and like there are in Appalachia, that Celtic culture. And there's a very famous writer called Dennis Potter, who was the sort of TV Shakespeare of British television. And by pure coincidence, my former teacher, Les Jones, actually was at Oxford with Dennis Potter. And Dennis Potter was a Forest of Dean writer. And the Forest of Dean is seen as a kind of place where it's maybe a little bit backward, or they speak in a very strange accent, and it's all the forest. But Dennis Potter described the Forest of Dean as a boy, where he grew up, as this heart-shaped land. And I loved the concept, because geographically, it's the River Severn and the River Wye. So the Severn, again, is linking me to my childhood and to Wales, and it's coming all the way down to Bristol to link my new life. And the forest is a sort of heart-shaped as well. And it was such a wonderful phrase that I thought, I'm going to write a blog. I'm going to communicate with a blog. It'll be really simple. And so the idea of the heart-shaped land was born as a blog, which I kept for 4 years while I was principal there. And it took over. I mean, Shakespeare once famously said, how do you start writing? You start writing. So at some point you putting it off or finding inspiration. And in some respect, I think it came really with that, with the heart-shaped land.
It's amazing. I love how we keep going on about J.K. Rowling, how we bring Harry Potter to our country. And I love the way, in my opinion, writing is amazing. I love writing, and I'm also taking literature this year for A levels. And yeah, I'm extremely inspired. But I do like how J.K. Rowling kind of just experienced all of this and portrayed everything in her book series, Harry Potter. Everyone knows Harry Potter, of course. And that's absolutely amazing how through meaning and through expression and emotion, she was able to create this masterpiece.
Well,
And
I mean, interesting about I know J.K. Rowling is, as a person, is perhaps there's some issues at the moment with comments made politically. But if we take her as a writer, because let's face it, all artists have some kind of controversy around them. I mean, painters, and that often comes to the fact that great pieces of creativity, art, music, comes from sort of trauma. It comes from experience. You're not going to experience great sort of moments by sitting at home on a tablet, without exposing yourself to life. I mean, you think some of the great I'm a big fan of Thoreau. Thoreau went and lived in the wilderness to get closer to nature. Some of the great George Orwell I talked about. I mean, he went and fought in the Spanish Civil War. He actually lived as a sort of homeless person in Paris and London to be able to write this book from a more authentic narrative. But with J.K. Rowling, she actually had quite a bad experience when she was a student at the school. Her mother was suffering from, I think it was multiple sclerosis. Her mother worked at the school.
That's right.
And so she had this from herself. But I interestingly, when we were looking through the archives, we found her school reports, which we did send her because we felt that was her her property, not, wonderful material for a future biographer. But it did talk about how this 13, 14-year-old girl would go and tell stories to her classmates in recess, which I thought was a great line. I mean, it's the sort of, the stuff of myth and legend, but there was plenty of material to deal with. I mean, all the characters in our lives and the people we meet, and, even taking a simple bus trip can turn into a story. And she based a lot of this on that. So I like that, but I think the Forest and Dennis Potter, her near contemporary. I mean, it was a coal mining area as well. So again, that links me to that. But again, these communities often had lots of strong traditions, and because life was so tough, people often used to find escapism. Now, my father actually took up painting when he retired, and I wonder whether there's something to do with. I mean, today the light is streaming in through my window here on Dutcher Boulevard, and the trees, and it's autumn, it's fall, it's beautiful. But without the light to stimulate, so a lot of miners, like my father, ended up doing painting as a kind of creative outlet later on in their lives. So with J.K. Rowling, I mean, this putting together her story, and we know the struggle. I mean, she's worth whatever she's worth now, several billion, and famous, and one of the most famous children's stories of all time. Up there with other. I mean, Roald Dahl's another wonderful influence. Another man with lots of problems and tragedy, but J.K. Rowling was turned down something like 42 times by publishers. She was a single mother, writing these stories in cafes to keep warm, to drink tea to last several hours, so she could use the warmth of the cafe. I mean, this is the sort of thing that when we look at great writers and writing, and we look at the influences, this is where it comes from. So.
Yeah, and she's also been going through lots of relationship problems, and despite that, I mean, she really had this drive. She pushed through it, and she also has a daughter named Jessica. I found out recently.
There we go.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, and what are some challenges when it comes to writing? Are there some obstacles or barriers that we have to go through, or? Like writer's block, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think discipline is quite important, and that can come in many forms. I was always fascinated with, like, Dylan Thomas had a sort of a shed. It was his last house was in Larne in South Wales, this beautiful Welsh coastal town overlooking the estuary, the sea. And he had he had a writer's shed where he would go and take himself and do his work. And what's interesting, you look at Roald Dahl. Roald Dahl had a lovely sort of space in the garden, and David McCullough's the same. So in that long line, not that I'm even comparing myself to these fantastic writers, I've had one book published, and I write articles for education magazines and blog. But I had a lovely cabin built for me at the bottom of my garden when my 3 daughters were born. And that, to me, is my space to go. And I've written in lots of places. I write, I'm lucky when I go to visit friends in Moldova, I get invited to their village houses, that I can often find real inspiration to write, and that quiet moment to sit down. Sometimes a lot of things that I write for education magazines, I can't fully say what I want to say because of the position I hold. And I find that sometimes a bit of a frustration, but then at the same time, I'm not writing completely freely. And I'm sure there's lots of questions or challenges that come from that. The blog I keep from here, which will be my second book, is called Mail from Moldova. So I put this together each month, and it's up to about 140,000 words now, I think. Plus about 25 articles from Times Education Supplement, which is the most sort of widely read education magazine in the world. But that is a real challenge, because sometimes there have been difficult. So if we take this year, and sometimes feeling the anger, the frustration, the senselessness of the war in Ukraine, the tragedy, what that means directly for us as a community right here in Chisinau, how we've lived in fear, what we know that's going on across there, slaughter and nihilism. That's been difficult not to kind of fully sometimes say what you want to say. And it's the same with sometimes the inequalities that we sometimes see, or some of the hypocrisy that we see, and that's very difficult to write completely freely, having this sort of, I'm not writing without another hat on as a leader of a education school group, or I'll share this story with you. I wrote a very strong piece this summer for International School Magazine called In Praise of the British Council. So I've been a British Council advisor for about 20 years. It's an incredible organisation for culture, for education, for 9 decades. It's one of the best things I love about my country. And it's all Paddington Bear and the Queen and that sort of stuff as well. But the British Council has gone through a very difficult time. Has funding reduced. The current government seems to be not very interested in this, what they call soft power, this cultural power of the UK. And I've seen that working all around the world, in every place I've been to, from Indonesia to Siberia to Quebec. And I wrote this really strong article, and I wrote in there a line about Paddington would have been deported. He wouldn't have had tea with the Queen because he came from Peru. He's an immigrant, and the current government's policy on immigration is not a good one in many people's opinion, including my own. And the British Council wrote back to me this week and said, we'd all love your piece. International School Magazine, by the way, didn't have any issues. They published it, but the British Council wanted to publish it in their internal magazine, and they said they couldn't. So they've changed it, but the problem is they've changed it so much now. It's flat. It isn't me. And often I've got a couple of really good editors that I work with in International School Magazine and for the TES, and they're actually very good. And for all writers, you often need that second, third, fourth pair of eyes when you do your first, second, third drafts. And I was very fortunate with This Heart-Shaped Land, because I had a former colleague who was setting up small publishing and wanted some projects, authors that were trying to get published. And it's called Mirabelle Publishing. And she was really good at the way that she was able to kind of not lose the sort of the book. But the problem with The Heart-Shaped Land, I never intended that to be a book. It was just purely a blog for the sake of communicating. And it's had limited success. It's there on Amazon. I'm sure we've got the links I can show. But Mel from Moldova, I've deliberately put that together because one, I want my children who haven't been able to come to Moldova with me because of the COVID crisis and everything else, I kind of want them to see this time. I want them to kind of see it through my eyes. I also can use that to talk about Moldova. I know the issues that exist in this country, but I also see so many positive things in this country. We've just come back today from, a woman who has decided that social responsibility and looking after dogs and doing something for this is worth doing, and it's selfless and it's socially responsible and it's duty and it's just charitable and it's altruism, and it's a brilliant example of what Moldova does at its best. And I like to pick up on these things, and I think Mel from Moldova has allowed me not to romanticize, and I don't want to do that, but actually not to put some nonsense on YouTube that Moldova has some broken steps in the city centre. And as we've often said, I can show you 10 minutes of London that would make you think that it's, the worst place on the planet. But it's to actually convey a narrative which gets lost in some cliches. And I think that's sometimes hard when you're trying to find your audience. I mean, a lot of people who are more published and more known and famous will say, be true to yourself, be authentic, write for your, that's not always as simple as it sounds, depending who your audience are and who's paying you. But at the same time, I think when you try to find your integrity and your authentic voice, that is much easier. The stream of consciousness flows when you do that. Often people that write for television or for theatre or turn books into films, they feel very constrained in the way that some of the greatest pieces of literature we have in poetry are when people have been able to go and sit in a boat shed, live a very bohemian lifestyle as someone like Dylan Thomas did. But he has, produced some of the world's finest poetry. He had a voice which was incredible to go with it. I actually watched the TV adaptation, the film adaptation with Richard Burton recently of Under Milk Wood, and it was so powerful. It was unbelievable, and it's funny coming back to that as well. But I think you develop as you write as well, and I think that's certainly the case that I find. Sometimes you worry if you're going to run out of stories, and that's part of, well, go and find stories, go and immerse yourself in experience. I think that's what all young people should be doing anyway, and and then you've got stuff to draw upon as well.
I absolutely love the way you add stories as you're speaking right now. It definitely.
I talk too much. Yes, you know that. We've known each other for a long time now, so you know that I speak far too much.
But that's great. I'm sure the audience would love to meet you in person and talk to you so much about all of your
Very welcome to come and visit.
experiences. Yeah, and speaking of these challenges, what advice might you give to young aspiring writers, students that are probably thinking about creating this career, or probably just they have this drive and urge to start, but they don't know where to begin?
I think we live in an age of such widespread social media that I love the term influencer. I wish I had tens of thousands of people reading my articles and buying my book. But actually, I don't want that. I think it's quite a shallow, trivial nature to that. But I do think there's ways of getting known and outlets to sort of, I mean, the first, from my humble experience is simply, write about what you know. I want to convey my sort of sense of the world, but I think sometimes I've noticed when I've tried to be too self-righteous, it just comes across as highfalutin, pretentious nonsense. And I do kind of critique my own stuff, but I'm also fortunate other people do too. I think don't be afraid. And actually, there's lots of different ways. I mean, I submitted an article 4 or 5 years ago to the TS, and I never thought I'd become a regular writer for them. And I kind of write in 4 or 5 articles a year for them. I contribute to other articles. I take part in. It's for me with education at my heart. It's been a really powerful way. International School Magazine is another one that, again, they asked me that there's something they wanted, a leadership series to write about, and so I was able to talk about my experiences in succession leadership and why we had to lead, why teams were better, why there wasn't a sort of the idea of the authoritarian dictatorial leader, which of course I have this big issue with the post-Soviet mentality sometimes of everyone looking to the leader, the redeemer, and actually it doesn't work like that. That's not how leadership works. It's about people with teams, different skills, and it's about enabling, it's about servant leadership and all those kind of. So I was able to put all that together, but it was coming from where I know. I tried to keep journals when I did traveling a lot, and there's one I've kept more for my children. And I'm a little bit embarrassed by some of the things I'm writing because it's obvious I'm trying to paint this huge picture and it's not very authentic. I actually write, I mentioned Les Jones a couple of times already, my mentor. He's 19, he's in Wales. And you might think this is not true, but I'll publish the book one day and you'll see. But I write to him every week. I write about a 4 or 5 page letter to him every week. And he doesn't do social media, he doesn't do email, he doesn't do texting, he doesn't do WhatsApp. And it allows me to write, actually physically handwrite. And I think this, we've talked about a joke, well, the working title is Letters to Les, but it's allowed me to kind of articulate and to put together thoughts and to keep on a sort of sense of things. And I think even in the newsletter I do for the school, we've called it the International Heritage Herald because that was one of the most famous international newspapers, the International Herald Tribune. So it's in a homage to that wonderful newspaper that brought stories around the world together. It only closed down sort of a few years ago. But even writing that, and I've called it The View from Dacha Boulevard, because that's literally what's out my window here, the view on Dacha Boulevard. that in itself allows a way of putting together a story each week or every couple of weeks. So, and I can't write poetry. I have no training. I can't do. I love good poetry, but I can't write poetry. I don't think I'll ever kind of get into writing poetry. It's not my métier to do.
Yeah, actually, about poetry, it's a quite a big thing in Moldova here.
I know it is. I know.
Have you gotten a chance to like see some
I've
of
got.
them?
I listen. One of my compliments for Moldova is the theatre and the commitment to arts and creativity here is so strong. It's one of the things I love about this country. And I've seen, and I've said this before the lockdown. I saw one of the I've seen a lot of Shakespeare in Stratford in London, and one of the best Shakespeare plays I ever saw was that we saw Hamlet here. It was in Romanian, but it was so powerful. Moldova has very strong commitment to creativity and arts. I think there's some brilliant performers and performances and companies that do that here. Poetry is not my strong point, I have to say. I like listening to good people speak. Because of my political background and my interest in politics, and listening to my father was a trade union leader. So being able to listen to, I mean, that in itself, that oral discourse, that sort of is really powerful as well. And often good debaters, good speakers really can it's almost like listening to sort of the written word in that sort of oral form, reading a good book. So that's also good as well. I did a lot of, I was very proud the debating tradition we had in the UK. And as a teacher, I took coached the first state school into one of the most prestigious competition, which is the English speaking union competition. We came runners up to a private school. But that was really good because these children, and going back to the accents and confidence, these children had very strong Bristol accents, which, if you know how pirates speak, educated pirates. So they were very self-conscious, but we held our own, and I think this is how we develop people as well, through the written and the spoken word. But there are lots and lots of different ways, and it's quite a journey. I saw there was a question and a hand up, so I just want to finish this one point. The book I really, really would like to sit in my cabin in Wales and in the hills and all that inspiration is I'd love to write a book about home, because I've been privileged to see the way that different homes exist and different people's concept of home. The German Heimat, the Welsh actually have a word called Hiraeth, which doesn't exist in English. We know about diasporas. We know about how the Moldovan. I mean, there's a positive of this country. Moldovans are everywhere. They are, and the talent and the skills these people have. Languages. The Welsh and the Irish are pretty similar, and the Armenians. So there's the sort of idea of what is home, and for somebody who left home at 18 and never went back, I really would like to explore this as a topic, but I really want to do it justice and not write for pay or not write for a deadline. And I think that's where I'd like to go at some point in my life. Mail from Moldova will be the second book. Okay, so that I don't know where the story will end. By the way, that's what I love about Mail from Moldova, because I intend to be here for a while yet. So there's lots of things being added. I never thought there'd be a war section, I can tell you that, or a COVID section. But there we go. Yeah. You've got questions, so I'm going to stop now.
Yeah. So from the audience, we're asked, what are you reading right now?
I'm reading Timothy Snyder at the moment, probably because it's more connected to my love of politics. So I'm reading the American historian Timothy Snyder, and that's looking at the sort of the disconnect in sort of Russia, and Snyder's well known for his work in looking at what's happened in Russia in the last 10, 20 years. I sort of feel like I can't ever come away from reading politics and history. The other book I just finished was on Doris Kearns, her book on leadership, which was looking at Teddy Roosevelt and Lincoln. So I always find it very, very difficult to sort of not get into this genre. Fiction, I really struggle to get into good fiction, and if anyone recommends good fiction, I always take a look at it. I don't know, because I think we're living in a very serious age. I find it hard to get lost in sometimes a novel, but I do enjoy Thomas Hardy. It's funny, I didn't really enjoy Hardy when I was younger, and Thomas Hardy and his stories about Wessex, and actually it's phenomenal writing. I mean, everyone knows Tess of the D'Urbervilles is such a powerful story. I love Far from the Madding Crowd, and I often pick up a book like this in the summer. I went back to Albert Camus. I found a copy on the train of The Plague in English, unfortunately not French. My French isn't that good. So I read Albert Camus on the train recently, thanks to somebody leaving a copy on the train. I do love a physical book, I have to say. I know there's no real debate for me whether you have it on your tablet or your e-reader or whatever, but I'm quite eclectic in my tastes, and it will come and go depending on the mood. There isn't anything I've got lined up that I particularly, apart from I want to finish this Timothy Snyder book at the moment. There isn't anything I particularly want to read at the moment. There's a book on East Germany, which sounds really awful. I'm doing some work later on this year with a history group because I was in Germany at the time the Berlin Wall came down, and it's kind of influenced my decision and my probably career to be interested in post-Soviet societies, and took me to Russia and Eastern Europe. We're doing a piece of work on this, and I suppose I'm interested in sort of that kind of thing. It's not quite nostalgia, but it is that sort of thing.
Wonderful. And actually, there's one more question. What do you do if you don't like reading or always fall asleep? How can I change that?
Right, I've got a really good answer for this one because it's what I've done in my entire life. I did it from university. Before podcasts were even probably called podcasts, this makes me really sad and old. I love to listen to history lectures. And one of my historian I've already mentioned, David McCullough, he has done many lectures around the world, which you can get on YouTube or you can get on sort of, different podcast providers. I love listening to his voice. He's the American Civil War series with Ken Burns. McCullough's got a wonderful way of just speaking and presenting the story of history. He said history is the antidote to hubris. So I always love. So I listen to him quite a lot. I was always loved. You probably won't have heard him, and for America House, this is really appropriate. But there was an English guy called Alistair Cook, and Cook went to America on a scholarship from Cambridge in the 1920s. Actually became friends with Charlie Chaplin, the great actor. Cook did one of the most famous radio sort of series in history. It lasted the longest. It lasted from the 1940s until his death, I think, in 2011. And it was called Letter from America, hence Mail from Moldova. And Cook would speak just for 15 minutes each week. He'd record it for the BBC. And I love listening to Alistair Cook. He had a wonderful voice, and he would have such an eclectic range of topics on the American life, from politics to Hollywood to all sorts. And he knew lots of different people, but he lived there in New York, overlooking Central Park. And I would fall asleep, but in a good way, listening to that kind of thing from Alistair Cook. But I also avoid coffee as well. That's always a good way, and try to avoid stress as well.
Yeah, these stories and these inspiring people that we hear from time to time, it's really important to kind of grasp a hold of their situations and what they're going on. And it's kind of like our own way of looking into other people's life. It's like writing is like a way of communication, as you mentioned earlier. It's a way to open someone else's portal. So that's really wonderful, as you said. And what are some philosophy authors that you recommend that are not as mainstream as Aristotle or Seneca?
Karl Marx. I don't know. Who have I enjoyed recently? Funny enough, I went back to Primo Levi recently. I found myself gravitating a lot in recent times to people like that. I love the work of Hannah Arendt. Maybe that's because of the history politics student in me. I find Hannah Arendt. I read on totalitarianism again this summer, just because where we are in the world with this sort of idea of, Francis Fukuyama, the American historian philosopher who, proclaimed the end of history with the Berlin Wall coming down in 89, 1991. Well, we don't live in an end of history period. That's pretty clear in the 2020s. And I've gone back to some of these people when we're looking at making sense of the world. I've even looked at people like Ivan Ilyin recently to see what influence they have had on sort of Russian leaders now, Putin in particular, where they are with their sort of how that influence has been on modern politics. I'm trying to think of the Romanian who have I quoted recently. Sorry, Jess, I'm getting older. My mind is blank at the moment. There has been a Romanian philosopher I've really enjoyed, and the name will come to me in a second as well. I think with philosophy, I think having the sort of the basis. I mean, I quoted Aristotle about man being a political animal to a class not only this week, and I think having that basis is important. But as I say, there are people who are writing now, and not just in the Western tradition, that are worth paying attention to. And often they don't get the sort of the publicity that others do. But I have to say, I think there's a bit of a poverty in development of thought at the moment, especially because of the sort of the almost existentialist crisis we seem to find ourselves in as a globe. I mean, there's some great writers who perhaps wouldn't label themselves as philosophers. I like George Monbiot a lot on what he writes about ecology and the sort of the sustainability that we need to sort of move over to. But I actually did jump back to Marx recently, not for any particular reason other than I've been in the British Museum not so long ago, and the reading room, and it just sort of I thought about being in this room and how, sitting in this room for years and years influenced an entire sort of shift in the 20th century to the world we're in right now. As I look at the Soviet legacy of my window here on Dacha Boulevard.
Thank you. And yeah, we have lots of comments thanking you for this very captivating experience. What are some opportunities that students can gain from writing? What are some very wonderful, experience that they can take from this? So,
what I would recommend, Jess, I think first of all, one of the reasons why I love Moldova is because you're not closing your libraries down. You're not, the bookshops are still here. Creativity and ideas are still here. People still talk. People still have narrative. I think it's important that, I mean, within school, recitals. I think I saw Mrs. Larissa from one of my dear colleagues, spelling bees. I mean, getting people into words, into sort of the magic of having a vocabulary which is beyond saying like an American teenager or a British teenager at the end of every sentence, or sometimes 3 times this sentence, like my daughters can do sometimes. I think book clubs are really powerful way of discussing literature. So setting up book clubs. They've often been amazing acts of rebellion as well. To set up. I love there's a writer in Moldova that actually came to do a founders lecture at Heritage, Paula Arezanu, who's the Calvert Journal, which isn't being published at the moment, is an amazing piece of literature and of sort of writing and of articles, and so those kind of things, discussing ideas and actually being able to do it in sort of a safe way without everyone being insulted or reducing it to an argument of words of no more than 1 syllable. I think being able to talk and listen to great writers, having poetry competitions, having recitals, being introduced to listening to great actors and people who speak the spoken word in such a powerful way. Those are all sort of things which, I think back to what captivated me as a student, or listening to people speak. I think all of us, okay, the world is a very, very complex place, as it always has been, but even more so in the times we live in. So it's always been important to explain our identity, who we are, where we're from, and everybody has a story, everybody has a narrative. And I think often being able to put that together and communicate it and discuss it and have it challenged, have those narratives challenged, because often we kind of sometimes cocoon ourselves in our own little echo chamber, and I think that's important to have that sort of critiqued. But I think good writers, good writing, even if you're not the ones writing the books, they can actually help you identify and make sense of who you are and in the world. I think there's some great LGBTQ authors now, which are now more mainstream and being published. And that's helping people identify, because we live in a very diverse, multicultural world and society. And actually, the more that we're aware of that and accepting of that, then we can avoid conflicts. We can avoid the idea that my society or my culture is better than yours, and that kind of thing. We don't want that. We don't want nationalist nihilism in the 2020s. We want to be able to take this apart. And I know we at Heritage do some great work, as other schools do, on things like misinformation, on disinformation, on being able to sort of challenge what has happened for a few years, which is the sort of, I don't want to say that as we're on Facebook, the sort of the Karen and Facebook approach. But I think if there's one thing that education's taught me in all the time I've been an educator and a student, is that actually learning is a deep thing. It's a deep process. You're not going to become an educated person or an intellectual overnight, or by picking up something in a 140-word text or a soundbite or a small sort of glib cliche. And I think it's a very deep process of actualization you go through. I mean, I'm probably a little bit older than most of you here, in my late 40s, and I sometimes still feel like I'm only just learning things about the life, and I can draw upon a rich life, but at the same time, there's lots of things I need to have explained, and I want a more positive world for the young people that I have the duty to look after, that in my care as a principal, as a director, my own children, my nieces, my nephews. But I think the more that we open our world up and not close it down, I think that's the better way forward. And I think all writing does that.
Of course, and before we do wrap this up, I want to actually, this one goes for the audience. I myself am I love writing. I just don't know how to express it with my own words. So, as Mr. Ford does say, writing is kind of like a way to look back or reflect on your own, coming of age, right? It's like a way to find yourself, identify yourself, and truly understand how you feel. And here at America House, you can definitely see that we have lots of
One of the
libraries.
greatest libraries in Kishinev. I owe 2 books to America House before the lockdown. I feel bad, but it's a great library, a wonderful library.
Me too, actually. I do have a book that I have to return, so sorry about that, America House, but yeah.
A great writer, C.S. Lewis, who, by the way, taught my former teacher, Les Jones, at Magdalen College, Oxford. C.S. Lewis, if you watch the film Shadowlands, it's a wonderful film with Anthony Hopkins, the great Welsh actor. But he said, we read so that we know we're not alone. We read so we know we're not alone. And I think of good writing, again, I'd be able to identify, being able to see our story isn't our own, it's happened before, it's happened in a similar way. I think often we've lost ourselves in a book because we've identified with a character, or we've identified with something that's in our lives. And that's really important. The best writers will do that. And finding those writers and finding those genres are really important. And back to the question earlier about philosophers, C.S. Lewis is a very interesting philosopher, as well as a writer of children's stories.
Yeah, and actually you mentioned about writing a story about home, right?
Yep.
I actually have a really good example that I really liked. I actually read it with Mr. Lux. It's called The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros, right? And I kind of was able to relate to that story. It's like a little collection of vignettes, right? And the way the author transmits and delivers this message, I was able to relate to it, and I'm sure many people did too, because it doesn't talk about just the house on Mango Street. It talks about different um, aspects of life, about relationship, about education, about classes. So, and the way how the author portrayed the message of just taking advantage of the little moments in life, to not take it for granted, and just the little meaning behind those little vignettes were so meaningful to me and to many others. So that's one of my uh, my story recommendations for everyone too. Yeah.
And a
And
great teacher. And I also think it's really important. I mean, often these lists will appear that says the 100 books you should have read when you were 16 or you were 21 or I didn't read Jane Austen till I was in my 40s. I think I was ready for it then. And I live not far from Bath and the Jane Austen house, and where she set a lot of her books and things. So there's lots of opportunities in life. I mean, the main thing is just read. And if you're ready to write, just write. And get on with it. And we need a good book club, Jess. Okay. And I know at the school we've started, Miss Tatiana Popper has started a brilliant international book club which I think is a fantastic idea, because we don't just want one version of literature. We don't want a Western or a UK, US. I mean, we want to be able to. I loved Indonesia for all the traditions there and the stories, and that was a wonderful, rich culture. So we need to bring, again, in our outward-facing outlook, we want all of this as part of our global culture.
yeah, and speaking about book clubs, we have tons of those here at America House, and everyone is welcome to come. We're actually gonna have a book club meeting, Fahrenheit, so that's a really good one too. And do you have anything else to say? Oh, by the way, Mr. Rob, we're definitely gonna share those links with everyone.
I'll finish on this. I found it my father's not very good at the moment. He's 82, and unfortunately, he's not in good health. So I went back to the UK a couple of weeks ago, and I've found it sometimes says write what you know, and sometimes can be emotional. But my blog for Mail from Moldova, which is out tomorrow. I wanted to write about decent men. I think I've got a real thing at the moment to talk up sort of. There's a thing called toxic masculinity and the idea that boys. And I just wanted this idea that decent men in the world. Sorry, it sounds slightly sexist, but it's not about that, because I think the future is female, thank goodness. But I think I looked at my father and I thought, I want to be able to sort of write something. So I found it very difficult to write about it because he's suffering from cancer. But it was like, sometimes, again, this is where we find our best, when our emotions are at their height and we can put that into words. I want to do that, not because I want to share that with the world per se, but I've got 3 children, and I want my 3 children, when I'm long gone, to actually know my life more and to see this part of me that they wouldn't know, because as a dad you don't see that. I'm just the guy that puts the dishwasher on and walks them to school or walks the dog. So that's really important too. So if you share the links, Jess, my Mail from Moldova, it's my latest blog is tomorrow.
I definitely will do that. And writing, when you are writing, there are moments when you have these little bursts of excitement and moments that you just quickly write down, like J.K. Rowling did during her train ride, right? And writing, there's no limit. You can go on and on and on, and
absolutely
just keep writing.
Go for a walk. I mean, right now, Moldova, it is its finest. The beautiful weather. Go and walk in the forest. Go and see the nature. Go and enjoy this autumn. Let's not worry about tomorrow. I know we should, but let's just enjoy our present and our world that we have right now. And if the electricity, whatever's going to happen there, or the gas, or the energy crisis, or let's go and enjoy our world that we have now, the beauty and the gift we have now. And that's a beautiful autumn fall day, and that should inspire many people, as it's inspiring me, as I've been up walking in the nice hills and the forests of Moldova. Fill up your senses, as John Denver said.
Right, guys. So make sure to live in the moment. Make sure to keep writing and reading, as Mr. Ford does recommend. And also, you can read and write at any age. There's no one stopping you, right, Mr. Rob?
Absolutely. And some of the best literatures come from those right at the end of their days as well, where they've had a look back at their lives. Patrick Leigh Fermor, I would definitely recommend Patrick Leigh Fermor, his travel writing, which he wrote when he was in his 70s. He walked across Europe when he was 18 in 1934. His stuff is amazing. He ends up in Romania, and he's a wonderful writer. So he wasn't until his 70s that he started to get this sort of accolade. Meant to be the basis for James Bond because he knew Ian Fleming, but I don't know. Right, Patrick Leigh Fermor.
Yeah, guys, I hope you did take notes because Mr. Rob did mention so many great authors, writers, and we also sent you guys a link, many links in the chat. So make sure to check those out and leave some comments too. I'm so happy Mr. Rob was able to join us.
Thank you for Jess. No, thank you for all the good questions as well. And like Jess said, drop me a line, or you know what, I'm at the end of Thatcher Boulevard. Nice to see you.
Thank you guys so much for watching this live. Thank you guys so much for the comments too. And I hope you did take in a lot from this session.
Thanks, Bye, Jess. Guys. Thank you, America House. You're doing a brilliant job in our country too.